When I told my son I had cancer, he didn't say a word. He just stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, until he finally muttered, "Okay," and walked into his room. No hug, no follow-up questions, not even a glance back. That's when I knew something inside him had changed, or maybe it had always been that way. And I just refused to see it. My name is Linda. I'm 58 years old. Retired early from teaching high school English after 32 years. I live alone in a modest house in Seattle. The one I bought with every bit of my savings after the divorce. My son Ethan, 27, had been living with me ever since his failed startup folded and he dropped out of med school. He said he just needed time to get back on his feet. That was 2 years ago. I didn't mind supporting him. Not at first. I had spent most of my life doing exactly that, supporting Ethan. Sacrificing for Ethan, shaping my entire world around my only child. After my ex-husband walked out when Ethan was 4, I poured everything into raising him. I worked 2 jobs, skipped vacations, avoided dating, and never once asked for anything in return. Just seeing him safe, seeing him try, that had been enough. Until now, I found out I had pancreatic cancer after a routine checkup. Stage 1, thankfully, but aggressive. The doctors were optimistic, said I caught it early, and if I committed to treatment right away, there was a real shot at remission. Still, the word, cancer, hit me like a freight train. I was scared, not of dying. I've never been one to fear the end, but of going through it all alone. That night, I sat Ethan down at the kitchen table. He was scrolling through his phone, one leg bouncing impatiently under the table. "Ethan," I said gently, "I have something to tell you." He didn't look up. I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It's early. I'll need chemo, maybe surgery later, but the doctors think I have a good chance. He blinked, barely registering my words. "You're sick?" he asked flatly. "Yes." "How bad?" "I'll need help around the house. The treatment's going to be tough." That was it. That was the moment I thought we'd connect. That he'd reach for my hand. Offer a hug. Say something. Anything, reassuring. Instead, he just nodded, stood up, and walked away. A few minutes later, I heard his bedroom door close. I told myself not to take it personally. People react strangely to illness, especially when it's someone close to them. I gave him space. I tried to stay positive. The next morning, he left a sticky note on the fridge. "Let me know when your appointments are." That was his version of support. I began chemo 2 weeks later. Teresa, a nurse referred by the hospital, started coming by 3 days a week. She was in her 40s. Gentle, funny, and more compassionate than I'd known how to ask for. She handled my meds, prepped meals, cleaned, even sat with me during my worst days when I couldn't lift my head from the pillow. Ethan, meanwhile, kept his distance. He'd leave for hours at a time, returning with fast food and excuses. He said being around sickness made him feel claustrophobic. He said he wasn't wired for this kind of stuff. I reminded him that Teresa was handling everything. I just needed him near. Just someone in the house who knew I existed. He shrugged. "You've got her. What do you need me for?" That sentence cut deeper than any diagnosis. I began to notice subtle hostility. He'd roll his eyes when Teresa walked in, mumble under his breath about how much I was paying her. One day, I caught him muttering something cruel about how nurses pretend to care so they can steal old people's stuff. I asked him, "What is wrong with you?" His face twisted. "What's wrong with me? You're the one inviting strangers into our house and acting like they're family. You'd rather talk to her than your own son." I didn't have the strength to argue. I was down 20 pounds. My hair thinning, my body aching from the inside out. All I wanted was peace. I hired Teresa full-time. Ethan didn't even try to hide his disdain after that. He treated her coldly, snapped at her over nothing, and once even locked the kitchen door so she couldn't enter to get my medication. Teresa never complained, but I could see the pain in her eyes. She was a professional, but she was also human. One afternoon, I confronted Ethan about his behavior. I asked him, as calmly as I could, to respect her, or at least stay out of her way. He exploded. "You're choosing her over me?" he shouted. You know what, Mom? I can't do this. I didn't sign up to play nursemaid to someone who clearly doesn't appreciate it. You ruined my life with your expectations. Your sacrifices. Maybe I wouldn't have dropped out. Maybe I wouldn't be stuck here if you hadn't coddled me my whole life. I was stunned. I wanted to yell back. To ask him how he could be so blind to everything I'd given up for him. But instead, I just sat there, too tired to fight. That night, he packed a bag and walked out without another word. No hug, no goodbye. Just like that, I was alone. I didn't cry when he left. Not right away. I sat in the living room with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching the taillights of his car disappear down the street. I didn't move for a long time. Just listened to the quiet, to the sound of my own heartbeat, to the hum of the refrigerator. It wasn't until Teresa arrived the next morning and found me still sitting there, in the same position, that the tears came. She didn't say anything, she just knelt beside me, gently took my hand, and let me cry. For everything. For the son I had lost, though he was still alive. For the illusion I'd held onto for too long. For the pain I couldn't name. After that day, I stopped pretending. I told Teresa I didn't want to talk about Ethan. I told my therapist that I didn't want to find a way to mend the relationship. I just wanted to survive. To breathe. To exist without constantly questioning what I did wrong. The truth was, I had done everything I knew how to do. I had loved my son the only way I knew, completely. Unconditionally. And without boundaries. That was my mistake. I had raised a child who believed that love came without responsibility. That family was a safety net he could trample whenever it suited him. And still, a part of me missed him. Every time the doorbell rang, a tiny flicker of hope would rise in my chest, only to flicker out when it wasn't him. But life didn't stop. My body, though broken, kept moving forward. The chemo treatments continued, the exhaustion, the nausea, the bone-deep ache, they were my constant companions. But so was Teresa. She became more than a nurse, she became a friend. She was calm, patient, sometimes stern when I needed it. She brought me soup, knitted scarves when I lost my hair, and told me stories about her daughters back in Manila. For the first time in a long while, I realized I wasn't truly alone. My oncologist adjusted my treatment plan to accommodate the mental toll Ethan's departure had taken. I started counseling twice a week. During those sessions, I would talk, and cry, and sometimes just sit in silence. And slowly, I began to stitch myself back together, one fragile thread at a time. When the final round of chemo ended, I didn't ring the bell. I didn't want to celebrate a milestone that felt so empty. Instead, I went home, took a long nap, and then opened the window to let the breeze in. It was late spring. The cherry blossoms on my street were blooming. It felt like a quiet kind of hope. A few weeks later, the scan came back clear. I was officially in remission. Everyone expected me to smile, to cry tears of joy. But what I felt was something entirely different. Relief. Not just because I had survived, but because I now had permission to start over. To finally live for myself. I took stock of my life. I looked at the house, the same one Ethan had grown up in. The same one that held more memories than I could count. Both good and bad. And I realized something. I didn't want to stay there. That house had become a monument to who I used to be. A caretaker, a mother, a woman who put everyone else before herself. So I sold it. I didn't tell anyone, not Teresa, not the neighbors, and certainly not Ethan, though I doubted he'd care. I listed it quietly, met with a buyer named Jason, and signed the paperwork within a month. He and his partner, Sarah, were a young couple, excited to start their own family there. As I packed my things, I kept only the essentials. A few photo albums, my favorite books, a ceramic vase my students gave me when I retired. Everything else, I gave away or left behind. And then, with nothing but a suitcase and a heart still piecing itself together, I moved into a small condo near the coast, just me, Teresa, and the quiet lull of the waves outside my window. I didn't feel guilty, not anymore. Ethan had made his choice. And now, I was making mine. I hired Teresa full-time, doubled her salary, and gave her her own room. She protested at first. Said it was too much. But I insisted. She was more than a nurse. She was family. We developed a rhythm. Morning walks along the water. Afternoons painting or reading. Evenings watching reruns of old detective shows. I even started writing again. Little essays and poems I hadn't touched since college. And slowly, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. I didn't check Ethan's social media. I didn't ask mutual friends about him. I stopped wondering if he'd call. Because deep down, I knew what I needed to know. He was alive. He was somewhere out there. Probably still blaming me for everything that went wrong in his life. And I was done carrying that weight. 3 months passed in quiet contentment. Each morning, I'd sip my coffee on the balcony, watching the waves roll in like clockwork. Teresa would hum softly in the kitchen while preparing breakfast. I had even joined a local book club, small, intimate, mostly women around my age who were all survivors in one way or another. Some had beaten cancer, others had escaped bad marriages. A few had simply decided to stop living for everyone else. One of them, Mary Ann, introduced me to her brother, Mark. I wasn't looking for anything. After all, I'd spent decades convincing myself that romance was a luxury I couldn't afford while raising Ethan. But Mark was kind in a way I hadn't seen before, low-key. Gentle and sincere. He didn't push. He just showed up. Brought flowers without fanfare. Fixed my leaky kitchen sink and never made a big deal about it. We started spending time together, quiet dinners, walks on the beach, slow conversations about life, loss, and starting over. He told me he had raised a daughter by himself after his wife left. That girl had just started college and encouraged him to get out there again. His eyes sparkled when he talked about her, like the kind of father Ethan never got to be. And never had. Sometimes I'd feel a pang of something, jealousy, maybe, or regret, but mostly, I just admired it. And in his presence, I felt safe, seen. Eventually, I moved into Mark's home. It wasn't a dramatic decision. No tearful goodbyes or elaborate packing. Just a quiet transition from one life into another. His home was warm and beautifully kept, full of books, soft lighting, and the faint smell of cedar. He made space for me, literally and emotionally, without hesitation. I had no plans of returning to work. My savings were enough, and for the first time in my adult life, I was no one's mother, no one's employee, no one's emotional punching bag. I was just Linda. And then, last week, the past came knocking. It started with a call from Jason, the young man who had bought my old house. "Linda," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I need to ask, do you know a man named Ethan?" I froze. "Yes," I said slowly. "He's my son." "Well," Jason sighed. "He just showed up at the house. Tried to open the door with an old key. When it didn't work, he started banging and yelling. My girlfriend opened the door and he screamed at her. Said she was trespassing. Claimed he owned the house. It got pretty intense. I didn't know what to say." Jason continued. "He said his mother, meaning you, had passed away. And that this was his rightful inheritance." I nearly dropped the phone. "Passed away?" I thanked Jason and promised to come by in person the next day to smooth things over. He was kind enough to agree but warned me that if Ethan returned, he'd involve the police. That night, I barely slept. Not from fear, but disbelief. Shock. That my son, who hadn't called or written in over a year, had shown up assuming I was dead, and more than that, expecting to walk into my home and claim it like some forgotten treasure. There was no note asking if I was okay. No message expressing remorse. Just a house he thought was vacant and money he thought was his. The next morning, I dressed in my calmest outfit, a soft gray sweater, jeans, and walking shoes. Teresa offered to come with me. But I told her no. I need to do this alone. Mark kissed my forehead before I left. "Call me if you need anything." I nodded. Driving back to that neighborhood was surreal. The cherry blossoms had bloomed again, just like they had the week I went into remission. The memories came rushing back. But they didn't drown me. They passed through me like wind through branches. Jason met me outside. He looked apologetic, even embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to drag you into this. I just didn't know what else to do. You did the right thing." I assured him. And then, as if summoned by the tension in the air, Ethan arrived. He pulled up in the same car he'd left in over a year ago. His hair was longer, messier. He wore a wrinkled hoodie, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. Two of his friends were with him, young men with loud voices and restless energy. They looked ready to cause trouble. As soon as Ethan saw me standing by the walkway, he froze. He pulled off his sunglasses slowly, his mouth falling open. "You're alive?" he whispered. "Yes," I said evenly. "Surprised?" His friends glanced at each other, sensing the awkwardness. One of them muttered something about going to wait in the car. Ethan took a step forward. "What happened to you?" "I thought. You thought I died." I finished for him. "And you came back for the house." He didn't deny it. "Where have you been, Ethan?" I asked, my voice soft. "No texts. No calls. Not even a card." He looked down, shoved his hands in his pockets. I figured if you needed something, you'd reach out." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The last time we spoke, you walked out of my life in the middle of my cancer treatment. Do you know what that did to me?" He looked up, his eyes rimmed with shame, or maybe just fear of losing what he thought was his. "I didn't mean to," he said quietly. I couldn't handle it. I thought maybe when it was over, I'd come back and fix things." "No," I said firmly, "you didn't come to fix things. You came because you assumed I died and left you the house." He opened his mouth to argue, but I stopped him with a raised hand. "I sold it, Ethan. I sold the house. I used the money for myself, for once. I spent it on peace, on health, on people who actually stayed when I needed them." His eyes widened. "You can't do that," he said. "That house was supposed to be mine one day." "No," I said, stepping closer. "That house was never yours. You lived in it, you were raised in it, but you were not entitled to it. And after the way you left, you don't get to claim anything from me." He stared at me like he didn't recognize the woman standing in front of him. "I'm your son," he whispered. "Your only family. You were." I replied. "But family doesn't abandon you when you're dying. Family doesn't only show up for the inheritance." He flinched like I'd slapped him. And for a long moment, he didn't speak, just stood there, blinking, the silence loud between us. Then he turned away, got back in his car, and drove off without another word. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel sad. I felt free. The drive home was peaceful. I didn't think about Ethan. Not the boy I raised. Not the man who walked away. Not the stranger who had shown up, hoping I was dead so he could claim a house he had never earned. Instead, I rolled down the windows, let the sea breeze tangle my hair, and focused on the now. When I stepped back into Mark's home, he was waiting in the kitchen, 2 mugs of tea already prepared. He took one look at my face and smiled softly. "You're lighter," he said. I was, in every sense of the word. That night, I sat on the balcony alone for a while. The stars were out, scattered across the sky like scattered promises. I thought about everything I had survived. Cancer, loneliness, the heartbreak of loving someone who couldn't love me back in the way I needed. I didn't feel broken anymore. The next few weeks passed quickly. I continued my checkups, clear. My strength returned. I started swimming at the local rec center, joined a ceramics class with Teresa on Tuesdays, and Mark and I began planning a short trip to Oregon's coast in the fall. Then, one morning, my phone buzzed. It was Jason. "I hate to bother you again," he said carefully, "but your son came back." I closed my eyes and exhaled. "Did he cause trouble?" "No, not really," Jason replied, "but he stood outside the gate for over an hour. He didn't knock, didn't say anything, just stood there. When Sarah asked if he needed help, he said nothing. Eventually, he left." "Thank you for letting me know," I said. "I'll handle it." After we hung up, I didn't feel panic or anger, just a strange kind of pity. Ethan was still searching for something. A way back in. A way to rewrite the past without owning any of it. That evening, as if on cue, I received a message request on my phone. It was from Ethan. His message read, "Mom, I messed up. I don't know how to fix it. Please, can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen. Part of me remembered rocking him to sleep as a baby, teaching him how to ride a bike, packing lunches with little notes, sitting in the front row at every recital, every spelling bee, every disappointment. But that part of me was tired. Another part of me, newer, stronger, remembered being abandoned while I fought for my life. Remembered the empty house, the door slamming shut, the sound of my own sobs. Swallowed in silence. I didn't reply. I didn't block him either. But I closed the app and set my phone down. I had nothing left to say. The next day, Teresa and I cleaned out my storage unit. I found boxes of Ethan's things, old clothes, high school trophies, a stack of birthday cards I had written but never gave him after he stopped caring about them. I took them to the donation center. I wasn't angry, just done. A week later, while walking downtown with Mark, I saw a job fair set up in the plaza. Dozens of people, young and old, carrying resumes, dressed in suits, waiting for a new chance. And there, standing at a table with a cheap plastic folder, was Ethan. He looked thin, worn, nervous. I stopped. Halfway across the plaza, Mark followed my gaze, then touched my elbow gently. "Do you want to talk to him?" he asked. I thought for a moment. "No," I said quietly. I already said everything I needed to. Ethan didn't see me, or if he did, he didn't show it. He stood in line, shifting from foot to foot, eyes darting, unsure of himself. And I kept walking, because healing doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it means learning to let go, without bitterness, without hope, without guilt, just peace. The kind that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that isn't earned through someone else's apology. It was mine now, all of it. Early one autumn morning, when the chill began to settle over the bay, I woke earlier than usual. Teresa was still asleep, and Mark was in his study, typing something for the city's education board. I wrapped myself in a soft cardigan, poured a cup of tea, and stepped out onto the balcony. The sea was calm, the sky, crystal clear. The surface of the water shimmered like a mirror untouched by time. And I thought to myself, I survived. Not just cancer. I survived a lifetime of being consumed by sacrifice. I had once been the mother who gave everything. The wife who was left behind. The woman who forgot her own worth. But now, I was Linda, a woman I never believed I could become, independent, at peace, and no longer waiting for permission to be happy. A few weeks later, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, I received a letter, handwritten. The scrawl was messy but familiar. It was from Ethan. I almost didn't open it, but something told me I needed to. "Mom, if you're reading this, then maybe part of you still wants to hear what I have to say. I don't even know where to begin. I know sorry isn't enough. I know I betrayed you when you needed me most. I left. I was selfish. I thought you'd always be there, no matter what I did. And when I came back, I really believed you were gone. You know what's the worst part? I didn't cry. I was just mad. Not because you were gone, but because I didn't get what I thought I deserved. And then I saw you. Alive, stronger, and I realized, you weren't the same mom I used to lean on. You had changed. And me, I was still the 27-year-old kid who didn't know how to love anyone but himself. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you live your life to the fullest. I won't ask for anything more. Thank you for loving me once, even when I didn't deserve it. Ethan." I folded the letter and tucked it inside the drawer of my nightstand. I didn't cry. There were no tears left for him. Only silence, the kind that felt whole. Like the ocean waves I could still hear, gently rolling in and out, indifferent and eternal. That evening, I told Mark about the letter. He looked at me and asked softly, "Do you want to see him?" I shook my head. Not now. Maybe not ever. But I forgive him. I no longer needed to be anyone's mother. I had given birth to myself. In a way. 1 month later, I hosted a small gathering by the beach, to celebrate 2 years cancer-free. Teresa made Filipino roasted chicken. Mark brought red wine. My book club friends surprised me with a tiny bonsai tree and a handwritten card. To the woman who chose herself, and never looked back. I smiled, because I didn't have to look back anymore. I was living now, fully, freely, and finally for me. No burdens, no guilt, No more proving myself. And in letting go, I found everything I had ever needed. A few weeks later, I took a walk alone at sunrise. The sky was painted in soft pinks and golds, and the sand beneath my feet was still cool from the night. The ocean whispered quietly, steady and timeless. I stood there for a long moment, just breathing it in, the breeze, the salt, the stillness, and then I saw him. Ethan. He was standing a few yards away, hands in his pockets, not moving toward me, just watching. His face was thinner than I remembered. His eyes tired, no arrogance, no anger, just a quiet, almost childlike sadness. He didn't speak, neither did I. We stood there in silence, separated by years of pain, mistakes, and love that had turned into something neither of us could name. Finally, I nodded, just a small gesture, not a welcome, not a reconciliation, just an acknowledgement that I saw him, that I had read his letter, that I understood, and then I turned, and kept walking, because I didn't need to fix anything. Some stories don't get a perfect ending. Some relationships never return to what they once were. And that's okay. I had found my peace, not in erasing the past, but in accepting it. I no longer lived for someone else's version of me. I didn't chase after apologies or beg to be understood. I had chosen myself. I had survived. And now, I was finally living the kind of life I once thought was impossible. Simple, quiet, mine. This story is a powerful reminder that healing doesn't always mean reconciliation, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. It's about reclaiming your worth after years of sacrifice, letting go of guilt, and finding peace without needing permission. If this story moved you, drop a 2 in the comments. If it didn't quite resonate, leave a 7. We welcome all perspectives. And if you want more real, emotional Reddit stories like this one, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Reddit Story for more.